Our speaker today is Matt Draycott. He's an Associate Dean at GBS within the Oxford Brookes University Partnership. Matt, it's over to you.
Cool, brilliant. Thanks, Annabelle. So hello, everybody. My name is Matthew Rogers-Draycott. Matt is perfectly fine, as Annabelle said. I am an academic who specialises in entrepreneurship. It's what my doctorate is in, and it's what I've taught and trained in for about the last 20 years. I'm also a practicing entrepreneur in my own right. I've run multiple companies, set them up, closed them, sold them, traded them out, and I've advised probably somewhere in the region of 1,000 startups now, give or take. So I know quite a lot about various aspects of entrepreneurship, and I teach a lot of people everything from how to generate early stage startups all the way through to building, developing, and improving high growth companies. Today, I'm really going to focus in on this notion of where do initial ideas come from? And I know we've kind of called this finding a viable business opportunity, but I think in a lot of ways we're probably going to end up going a little bit broader than some of that. And I'm going to share with you, I suppose, a range of things that link into this notion of what it is to find a viable business opportunity, right? So we'll talk a little bit around, if I can get my slides to move forwards, we'll start by talking a little bit around some of the myths and preconceptions that people have around coming up with a business idea. And if everybody do me a favor, if you're not talking, would you just mute your mic, because otherwise I get a load of feedback, and that would just be really helpful. So thank you. If you're not grabbing me on the call, if you just mute your mic off, then I won't get to hear my own voice talking in weird stereo. Thanks, everybody. So we're going to start by doing a quick bit of myth busting. And there are a lot of kind of myths and misconceptions around what it means to come up with entrepreneurial ideas. And I think it's good to disabuse people of some of those initially. These are things that I've found both in my teaching and in my own practice. Then I'm going to talk a bit around where you find ideas. And I'm going to go a little bit deeper than that, because I'm going to, in some ways, give you some categories, some kind of selection parameters. And then I'm going to talk about where we find ideas. I'm going to talk about how you pick from your ideas which ones might have some ability to grow, develop, be more useful. And I'm going to try and do all of that in about the next 25 minutes. So I've set myself quite a big target here. I normally do this in about an hour and a half. So we're going to rock it through a few bits, and I've changed a few other things to make it a bit easier. So hopefully you find this really useful. If at the end of this you want to ask me any questions, I'm more than happy to do that. I'll have some time to answer those. So without further ado, let's get started. And let's jump in right away to this point about myth busting. So let's start with one of my favorite myths. If you're going to be an entrepreneur, you need to build the next Facebook. You don't. If we look at the UK today, most of our entrepreneurs are running small and medium enterprises. These are businesses that are 250 people or below. Those businesses represent about 50% of our economy, and they represent about 50% of our gross domestic product and our employment. So they're incredibly valuable to the British economy as a whole. And that picture is true across most of Western Europe and the northern part of the Americas as well. South America is slightly different, but that's a general perspective. So actually, we know that a lot of businesses in our economy are small, and you may go 250 people is not small. But if I were to tell you that of those businesses, around 80% of what we call micro businesses, so that means businesses that employ less than one person, then actually the picture we get is an economy which is primarily run by these small and medium enterprises that are incredibly important. And this might be anything from a plumber, a gas fitter, somebody who does some marketing, somebody who writes some copy for a magazine. It could be somebody running a local tea room or coffee shop, a cleaning company, a car wash. The number of these businesses is just huge, and their scope and scale is phenomenal. What you don't need to become obsessed about is building the next Facebook, building the next high growth unicorn style business, because for most of us, it's simply not a reality. I did a sort of sense check on myself recently. I've started something like 30 companies, and I've had 3 of them really work. One in high-end electrical retail, one in fashion, and one in recruitment. None of them in tech and apps have ever really worked. And I don't think you need to kind of focus on that and see that as your end goal. Whatever you need to do, whether that's build something that will keep you and your family, or build something that helps you, or build something that puts you in a better financial position, that's probably really what you want to be aiming for, not worrying about, can I build the next big crazy thing that will really take off? If you want to do that, great. But generally, a lot of people who start down that road find it very tough. Most of those unicorn businesses, incidentally, tend to be accidental in terms of how they were created. So the next common myth is that everybody shares your problems. They don't. You might see a problem, or you might experience a problem and think, great, I can create a business to address that. Just because you feel that way doesn't mean a big enough group of people do, so that you'll actually be able to build something that is sustainable, something that can grow, something that has potential. And one thing you've really got to do when you're conceptualizing businesses or thinking of what you'd create is to take yourself out of the equation slightly. Oh, hello, we've had a load of noise there. Again, if you can mute your mic, that would be awesome. Thank you. Is to take yourself out of the equation slightly, and sometimes to actually look at these things a little bit more objectively in terms of, what can I create, and is there a big enough audience then that I can actually earn something from that? You need to focus on technology. Again, simply not true. Tech is certainly an important part of our modern economy, but it doesn't need to be the focus of the businesses that you create. It may be a part of them. It may even underpin how some of them operate. Certainly, I couldn't have run a recruitment business without a pretty advanced IT system, but it doesn't have to be everything that you do. People all around the country every day set up very successful small businesses which have no forbearance on technology in the way that we would expect them to. Okay, they are simply not reliant on it in that fashion. Everything needs to be original. I'll put my teeth back in there. It doesn't. There are really good businesses which are carbon copies brought into new areas. So it might be taking an existing model and franchising it into a new area, or developing a new country in a different way. It could be bringing products to a new country they haven't been sold in before. It could be taking an idea from a country that you're aware of, have ties to, links to, and bringing it to the UK. There's lots of opportunities to simply change models. We don't necessarily have to create something new. And certainly many businesses are deeply unoriginal in the way they operate, and yet still incredibly successful. I was talking only a few months ago to a friend of mine, and he has a very successful business as a drain cleaner. Not an interesting business, not a tech business, certainly not a unicorn. But as we were talking, and we were talking about last year's earnings, he told me that he made £170,000 last year cleaning people's drains. So there is no pressure there to, again, come up with something that is totally new. Sometimes really good ideas, done simply, done in new ways, can create very viable businesses. And finally, doing more will make something better. More features. It needs to do more of this. It needs to be bigger. It needs to be shinier. It needs to brush people's teeth while wiping their face and washing their hands. No, it doesn't. Sometimes doing one thing really well is enough. For me, I tend to call this sort of my Doc Martens moment, right? Now, I know Doc Martens have diversified since they made Just Boots, but the core of their offering was shoes for many, many, many years. And the reason people like me bought Doc Martens and still continue to is quality, durability. You know, I don't buy them because they will also keep my feet smelling fresh or do whatever else. I buy them because they're simply the comfiest, best boots for me. So things can be simple. They can focus on a few really key elements of quality and do that very well. And it doesn't need to be bigger and bigger and bigger all the time. So those are my kind of 5 common myths that I think everybody should be aware of coming into this process. You don't need to create the next unicorn. Just because you have a problem doesn't mean other people will. You don't need to just focus on technology. It doesn't need to be the most original concept. And you don't need to keep making it bigger. Do 1 or 2 things really well, satisfy those customers hugely, and you'll find you get repeat custom from that. So where does that take us to? Well, it takes me to some examples that, interestingly, I think a good reflection of those rules. Hi, guys. If you're on another call as well, could you just mute this, please? Hi, Farah. I can hear you in the background.
Okay. Sorry.
Thank you.
Just 1 second. Yeah, I'm going to mute.
There we go. Thanks very much. That's a first. I've never had somebody else on another call. Okay, so let's look at some examples of some of these. Well, first of all, let's take WD-40. Good old, one of the 2 objects other than gaffer tape that keeps the universe together in the mind of all engineers. WD-40 is called WD-40 because it was the 40th iteration of a formula that the scientists developing it were testing, and it turned out to be really good at helping things to move. It's a very simple silicone spray. It's not a particularly interesting product, but it's incredibly successful. Post-it notes. Post-it notes were an accidental discovery. They developed a glue that didn't stick permanently and wondered what to do with it. They created the Post-it note, which has now been copied into thousands of derivatives the world over by hundreds of other manufacturers. But they are the original and still potentially some of the better ones, although others are available. Fidget spinners, hugely successful little items, have spawned a whole category of toys, sort of fidget toys. But again, incredibly simple thing, just a bearing, some weights, and a bit of plastic. Crocs, love them or hate them, they are a very simple piece of footwear that is ubiquitous with the style and design that they have become. And down the bottom, if you're familiar with this good old pet rock, this was a piece of work by an American entrepreneur back round about the 1970s. They sold about $6 million worth of pet rocks through the 70s and 80s, and it is fundamentally just a rock, a bit of raffia, and a little guide that goes with it. So again, not a hugely complex piece of work. Again, guys, I'm getting a load of people still with their mics on. So if you're not asking me a question, can you please turn your mic off, guys? Because I get a lot of feedback on this end when people turn their mics on. Thank you. Okay, so
hi, Matthew. Really sorry for disturbing you. Just a quick question. So is this meeting about setting up a business? Because I already have the business set up. So I'm not sure if I'm in the right place right now.
So this session is supposed to be more about where do people get an idea from about developing a business.
Okay, because I think then maybe I will join the next meeting then. Okay,
not a problem at all.
Is that okay? It was nice meeting you anyway.
Nice meeting you too.
Thank you. You have
That's
a
all right.
day. Bye.
Okay, so with those sort of myths and ideas out of our heads, where really do we get started with all of this? Where do we find an idea and begin to do something with it? Well, again, I have a little bit of advice around that in terms of where to start. To think about this, the easiest way to consider it is to think that all buying decisions that we have fall on a spectrum between things that we need and things that we want. There's lots of space on that spectrum that reflects all the different reasons that we buy anything. But fundamentally, that's our picture that we're working on, okay? Now, if we think about this in terms of some product categories, well, let's think about something that we need. It could be food, it could be fuel, it could be housing. These tend to be some of our very basic needs. Now, of course, as our lives get more complicated, some of those needs may become bigger, perhaps a mobile phone, a laptop, other things that we might need for our children or relatives. But things that we need have powerful motivators behind them, because actually, if we as human beings can't do without those, then companies who sell them to us have extreme power in the relationship to set price and to set the terms on which we buy. On the other side, there's stuff that we want. Now, things that we want can be myriad. It really depends on who we are as individuals. Could be anything from a new piece of clothing to a piece of technology, an expensive meal out, tickets to the football. Those things, they tap into very powerful emotional motivators and satisfiers. So both of these positions can work really well for a business. Generally speaking, things that we need tend to be less highly priced. Things that we want tend to be where we generate more revenue through added value and the ability to really sell the customer something special, something different, something interesting. As I said, both positions can work very well depending on your business model. But for me, the most powerful position is being in need. If I'm something that people need, then they don't have the decision simply to put me down and put me away. I am always there in the background of every decision they make. And I call this being a painkiller. And I liken this to the decision to buy painkillers, right? When we don't feel great, when we've got muscle aches or a headache, or we're not feeling good, certainly I tend to reach for a packet of paracetamol, packet of ibuprofen. And I've always got those in the house. They're not high value items, but they're repeat purchases that I will probably engage in multiple times throughout a year. And I need them because fundamentally they take away the pain that I am suffering at that particular point in time. So that's an incredibly powerful position for the companies who produce those products, because they know I'm always going to come back and repeat purchase. Being a painkiller in that sense as a product is a great position to be. Whether it's Dropbox for sharing my files, or whether it's the Microsoft products that I utilize every day, my mobile phone, any number of things in my life are pretty fundamental needs to do the job I do and live the way I want to live. And so when I think about the kinds of businesses I want to create now, generally speaking, I want to appeal to things that people need, because I know that when I do, I will ensure myself more repeat customers. I'll ensure myself more what we call lifetime value. And generally speaking, it's much easier to retain a customer and generate more revenue from them than it is to bring in new customers all the time. So I want to try and be in that situation where I've got people coming back to me. I have opportunities to increase how much I sell to them. That is a great, great position to be in. Wants can be very powerful, but it depends on the kind of product. Generally speaking, if you're going to produce products that leverage wants, then you've got to create really deep, strong emotional attachments to them. And that might be through the brand. It might be in terms of how you market or retail it. It might be the experience that you offer. But generally, there's a lot of added value to put there, but there may then be added return. So once we've got this picture of needs versus wants, how do we start to find ideas? Well, often one of the best positions to start from is ourselves. Normally, if we were doing this a little bit more interactively, I'd work through this more with you all as a workshop, but I'll just show you a kind of basic picture for thinking about where an idea might come from. So what I like to do is I like to look at the things around me. I like to look at the experiences I have. I like to look at the contacts, the people I know. I like to look at the resources, the things that I have access to. I like to look at my abilities, the things that I can do. And I like to look at the things I'm passionate about, things that I really love doing. And I like to collect those up into 5 lists. So I'll just list those out, right? And I might have 5 or 10 things in each of those lists. And then what I'll start to do fundamentally is look for connections between them. Are there connections between the things I love and the people I know that I can leverage into a business? Are there connections between the things I love and the abilities or experiences that I have that I can create something out of? A good example of that would be, for me, probably something like a training company. Are there particular resources that I can access which other people can't, that I could leverage through my experiences and contacts to create something? This exercise of mind mapping, looking at what's there and selecting, can be a really useful way of starting to think about what you have, what you can do, what you're good at, and how you might be able to turn that into something relatively successful in the market. However, it's not the only way you can do this by far. Some other approaches include things like networking. One of my friends, who's a great businessman, has a very simple model. He goes and interviews 20 or 30 other business people. He asks them what their main problems are. He creates a list of those. He cross-references them and finds out which problems are repeated by the highest number of people, and then he builds a business to go and solve that problem. Very simple, highly effective, especially because he generally targets very wealthy, very successful business people who have money to burn on those kinds of projects. But you can do that very simply. Stand on a high street with a clipboard and ask people, what do you need here? And come up with a list. I've done that on more than one occasion in my life. Go and scan the environment. Are there opportunities in your local area that are underused? Maybe it's a shop that's been empty for a while, or maybe it's an industrial unit that's not being used. Maybe it's a piece of land or a particular thing in your local area that you can add to. What's around you that could be turned into a profitable business? I used to take students out for a whole day when I worked down at the Royal Ag Uni, and we'd wander around Swindon and actually look at the environment around us. And I'd challenge them to say, what kind of businesses could you create in these empty units, or that would benefit the local area? And that can be a really interesting way of identifying things that you've not seen before and thinking about them differently. Look at the market. Are old models of doing business starting to fail in terms of how they satisfy their customers? Has a new model come around that's created some kind of novel opportunity or potential that you could also get involved in? Now, this is one where you have to be quite careful. It's quite easy here to get sucked into a lot of scams, anything from crypto to multi-level marketing. But if you're careful around this and you look at those models quite critically, it's sometimes quite easy to identify things that aren't working and think about new ways of doing them. And finally, you can, of course, ask AI. There's lots of people at the moment playing with AIs to explore what they can tell you about potential business ideas, potential markets. And I certainly think it's a good idea, but you've got to be quite critical of what those systems produce, because they can produce an awful lot of junk. And they have a tendency not to lie, but certainly to hallucinate, because they have biases based on the data they've been trained on as well. It's the same reason that it's not a great idea just to base your essays on what the AI tells you, because generally they're not quite right and we can see it. The same is true in business. If you rely too much on the AI, generally you'll find that it takes you down all kinds of rabbit warrens that don't really work. And most of the people who did the early stage testing of that process, trying to generate ideas with AI, actually have found it wasn't hugely successful. So where can you look for information? Well, number one, quality news sources. The BBC, The Guardian, the Financial Times, the big broadsheet traditional newspapers. They're great. Look at them, see what they tell you about the market, what's changing, what's adapting, what's happening. Then look at things like really good blogs by good business people. There are numerous ones out there. You can look at podcasts. There are hundreds of business podcasts. Some like Freakonomics or the $100 MBA are fantastic. There's also a great podcast called How I Made This, where they explore how businesses were created over time. That's really useful if you're looking for inspiration. You might look at other company reports and pieces of company information that's out there. So I could go and look at published reports for large companies. I could even go and look at companies' house records and see how smaller businesses are performing. I can certainly look at websites, but again, be careful to take those often with a pinch of salt and a bit of criticality. Anybody can write a website these days and say anything about business. Understand the sources you're looking at, and the same is very true of social media. It can be a really useful tool to see how markets, ideas, opportunities are changing, but be critical about what you're looking at and always go and do additional research on top of that. Finally, I want to just tackle in the last few minutes of this talk, this notion of how do you choose which ideas to take forwards and which not to, in a very simple way. There's a lot more complexity to the decision-making process, but this gives you a few rules that I tend to live by and come back to when I'm thinking about the ideas that I might take forwards. First things first, the most obvious one, is it a painkiller? That's always the first thing I come back to. If I'm taking away somebody's pain, that is a really good notion that I'm on the right track in terms of a business I'm developing. If the idea isn't a painkiller, does it offer something really valuable? Because if I'm going to leverage those wants, then I need to make sure I've got loads of value in there for the customer. I create that really deep emotional attachment to the brand or to the notion or to the marketing, and I get them deeply involved in the concept. Is there something about the idea that makes it hard to copy? In business, we call this the notion of competitive advantage. And it's not all of competitive advantage is based on how hard something is to copy, but it's certainly a key element of it. The harder an idea is to copy, generally the easier it is for you to defend it, and very often the simpler it can be to market it to customers. Is it feasible for you to do this, either by yourself or as part of a team? If you can't do it, what can you do that might take you there? What can you do that might be a first step or part of an approach to get going? And finally, is the market sufficient to make the business viable? This is where you need to do some maths. Is there a big enough number of customers? Do all those customers pay enough? And over time, can I create new things to sell to them, to develop with them, that actually over the longer term, or whatever term I'm perhaps stating for this business, not all ideas run over the longer term, but certainly I try to generally think about it this way. Is it feasible that this will really work? Now, if I can answer yes to most of those questions, I probably think I'm onto something. You know, one or two, I might answer yes or no to one or the other of those, but 3, 4, and 5, I'm really looking at positive answers to those. And if I'm getting negatives, then this probably isn't an idea I want to take forwards at this point in time. It might be an idea I put in a little box and come back to later, but it's probably not something I'm going to go headlong into developing straight away. So those are 5 kind of initial selection tests that can be useful when you're trying to think about which ideas you might take forwards and be a bit critical about them. So finally, what should you do next? Well, first of all, get out there, start looking around you, start reading, start consuming the news, start taking an interest in business and the world and what's happening. Most good ideas come from having a really sound grounding in what's going on around you. Every day, listen to some news, listen to it on your smart speaker, pick up a podcast, read a good newspaper, look at it online. Go and look at the world around you, look at your resources, do that kind of mapping of what's around you and what you can access. And then start trying to develop some concepts. What could these look like? Do they pass those tests that we've just talked about? If not, what might that mean? Go and get some advice, whether it's from people like myself or the staff here within the Entrepreneurship and the Careers group. or whether it's broader advice out there in the economy. And there is a lot of it available to you. Sometimes it's not the easiest to access, but certainly in the UK, we have a relatively good infrastructure to support entrepreneurs in the development of their concepts. And finally, test them relentlessly. When you've got an idea you think works, find a way to go out and play with it and see if you can break it. There's an old adage in war that no plan ever survives first contact with the enemy. I like to say that no business ever survives first contact with a market. Very often we have to change things, adapt, alter them. So when you've got a concept, get out there and play with it with real customers. See how they react, see what they like and don't like, and decide on the basis of that whether this is something you really want to take forwards. And finally, although I've not put it up there, have fun with this, because if it's not something that you're enjoying, it's a very difficult process over time to take forwards. Running your own business, doing that off your own back can be tough. So make sure that what you're doing is something you're passionate about and interested in, because that will make the whole process a hell of a lot easier in the long run. So I'm running a little bit over time there, but we had to stop a couple of times. So I think that's okay. What I will do now is drop off my slide share, and I can see there's some questions in the chat. So I'll pick through a few of these and just see if I've missed anything. I don't think I've missed anything in the chat from anybody. I think Annabelle's answered those, and yes, the video will be available later. So has anybody in the call got any questions then for us, or for me specifically?
Don't be shy now, guys. Come on.
No, there's no such thing as stupid questions. I'm more than happy to answer anything anybody wants to know.
I don't think so. Personally, I do not have a question still or yet, but I think there is a lot of things to reflect about. So take time and reflect about all these ideas put together. Now is something new. So you can, the idea I've got before and what I heard now. So I combine them and thinking about. So it's interesting this way. But I can find a question for now.
That's okay. Well, thank you. I mean, yeah, I think it is something. It's certainly something that I would say, you want to go away and think about. And the key thing really in all of this is like I said, play with these ideas. It's often as well not necessarily your first or second or even third or fourth idea in business that will work. Often it takes a number of tries to really get something off the ground and to get it moving. I was relatively lucky the first time round. Our first business did work quite well. But between my first business and my second business is probably 7 or 8 abject failures that just didn't work for all kinds of reasons. And that is one of the parts of running a business that often people don't talk to you about. That very often it does take a degree of sort of failure. And especially when you're coming up with ideas, very often you'll come up with something, you'll think it's great, you'll develop it a bit, get it out to the market, and then customers won't really like it, won't really engage with it. And that can suck. It can feel really hard. Sometimes it's overcoming those initial kinds of rejections and challenges that are what really separates successful business people from those who don't make it. And it is tough to say that, but it is quite true. Most of us who have built something of any kind of size will tell you that we've had a lot of knocks along the way to doing that. And so don't be afraid of that. Embrace it, learn from it. When stuff doesn't go right, what went wrong? Why did it go wrong? What could you do differently next time? Those are all important questions to ask. I think often failure isn't celebrated enough for the learning process that it is. We get very down on people about, you failed, something's gone wrong, it hasn't worked. But often actually the learning from that can be really important.
One of my previous teachers says fail could be interpreted as a first attempt in learning. Could be a positive.
I think that's a really good way of putting it. Exactly. Thank you. Sorry, John, you were going to say something.
No, I was just going to say, actually, I think
your point about focus on me, because so often, there's something that we want to do or try to do, and the sort of accessibility isn't there, and we just get upset by it and storm off rather than think, okay, what's the solution here? And that's where a lot of entrepreneurial ideas and good successful businesses are created. So I think it's really important to think about what affects the individual too.
And often it's about, when you've got that idea, sometimes disassembling it and deciding where you start. It's really easy to go, I've got an idea, but I can't get it going. And sometimes the challenge is to take that idea, take it apart and go, okay, where could I start with this? I'm minded of a great example that was around one of the very early sort of food delivery apps, food delivery to home, the kind of get fresh boxes. And when they were designing it, they started out with an idea that they actually wanted to found a personal chefing business. And what they did was they picked 5 or 6 customers, and they went into their homes for a period of about 4 months and worked with them. And in each instance, they started with a very, very expensive, very highly personalized service. And then they slowly rolled it back to the point where they got to something not far off the sorts of boxes and sort of design recipes that we see delivered out today. And when they looked at the process of doing that, it was that moving back that actually helped them to find the business that was most viable, because the personal chefing business was incredibly effective if it was just one person. If you were a personal chef and you wanted to make a load of money, go and cook for rich people, great stuff. It wasn't scalable. It would never be a business bigger than that. You could hire a lot of personal chefs and take a cut from them, but it still wasn't a good sort of investment. And so they found that by actually backtracking to the point where a business that could be scaled appeared. Another great example is Zappos. If you've never heard of them, they were the first people really to sell shoes online. And the story of Zappos is a really interesting one about overcoming a challenge, because in the 1990s, people were pretty sure that nobody wanted to buy shoes online. There was a pretty strong view that nobody would do it. And a couple of these guys came along and said, actually, no, we think people will, but none of the shoe manufacturers would do business with them. So they started a website. And what they would do is they would go to local sneaker stores in the US and take pictures of sneakers and put them on a website with a price. And when somebody bought those sneakers, they would drive back to the sneaker store, buy the pair of sneakers and ship them to them. And over time, this business grew and grew and grew. And it got to the point where they were banned from a lot of their local sneaker stores. And they were driving actually interstate to go and buy the sneakers to ship. But over a period of time, they built a data set that showed, actually, people do want to buy shoes online. We can prove it. We're selling X thousand pairs a month. We're not making any money doing it, but we're selling them. And they went to the shoe companies and said, hey, guys, make us a distributor. And they went, okay, cool. Yeah, you've got enough sales. We'll do that. And Zappos was so successful, it was bought out by Amazon. So if you want to look at a quality level, if you pass a certain quality threshold, if you get bought by Jeff Bezos, you've got the right model. He's very selective in what he purchases. So they definitely are on a good track there. And there are lots of other examples of this that we see around us. So there's a couple of good stories that I always like to bring out at moments like this.